Oh, very nice to see you.
Nice to see you over this century.
Oh,
Yes.
You're so familiar to me. I feel I've spent so much time looking at you. Not just when we were filming, but in later renditions when I look at what we filmed. So you're terribly familiar, and yet at the same time, it was 30 years ago, actually.
Apparently, rumor has it was 30
so they say. So they say.
It's a difficult thing to imagine. It's a difficult thing to imagine that it's 30 years ago, and it's also quite amazing that we're still talking about it. Who knew it was possible to go on talking about a film for 30 years? What a privilege.
Indeed. Yeah. Indeed, a privilege. And of course, there are people for whom this is a new film.
Brand new, made last week. And people who weren't born, lots of people, I hope, out there right now who weren't born when we made it. And it's
but does it feel like a long time ago to you?
I mean, I suppose, to be honest, I don't know that we ever finished. I feel we're still making it somehow. And in a funny way, I suppose we are. I mean, talking about it now is a way of making it.
It is, yeah. And given that the nature of the story was emerging out of the past into an eternal present, I mean, we are in that eternal present.
Yeah.
So,
I will say that I did see it not that long ago, last year, 2022, in a tent in Glastonbury, with a lot of people who weren't born when we made it, and they got a real kick out of it, and felt and said, were very kind enough to say that they felt that it was very fresh. So I hope that people watching this will feel similarly.
I had the same experience showing it at Telluride and just recently, and with a lot of very young people who were sitting up, who were very alerted by it and by not just as young filmmakers and what it did about cinematic syntax that excited them, but also all the things that they're struggling with or thinking about gender and identity and history and what happened in the past and what is there going to be a future and such things. So it felt very, very pertinent and very living, which was very nice to see.
The thing that strikes me, and I've thought about it a fair bit over the last few years, because I've also had the great pleasure and privilege to work on the subject of Virginia Woolf's book for an edition of Aperture, which is a photographic magazine. So I had another chance to sort of go back and think about Virginia Woolf's book, let alone our film. And it occurred to me that it's really not about gender at all. There's a sort of legend about the book and about the film that it's a sort of drama about sex change or something. And I don't really think it is at all. I think it's about boundarylessness. And my fantasy is that if Virginia Woolf had gone on to write another 500 pages, Orlando might have turned into a spaniel in the next chapter or a
I mean, I went back and looked at some of my notes when I was writing the adaptation endlessly and found that even then I was spending over and over again trying to find the core of it that would propel everything. And I found it was really about, for me anyway, my interpretation was that it was a meditation on impermanence, that everything changes all the time, and that therefore it was, I agree with you that though the storyline is about life as a man experience and then life as a woman experience, that wasn't its central motivating or propelling theme, really. It was
and also, do you remember when, I mean, I remember it, I'm sure you do too, as if it were yesterday, when we were figuring out or trying to figure out how for me to play, how to play this morphing spirit. And we spent about 5 minutes talking about difference and then realized that it wasn't about difference at all. It was about finding something that was consistent. Absolutely. That actually didn't change.
Yeah.
And once we'd uncovered that, then that felt quite graceful. And then then it was all about finding out who Orlando was, regardless of what he or she was wearing, or how anybody else saw he or she. And the sort of all that Orlando-ness was what kept us going, really.
Yeah, an unchanging core in the middle of perpetual change, but also really not about identity. I never thought it was anything to do with identity. Yes, about how you're treated differently and how you're perceived and so on. What I remember us talking about a lot as well when we thought about how to approach it was the question of innocence, a kind of essential innocence that I think you embodied in an really astonishing way. So I remember that quality sort of propelling how we're born, in other words, how we're born, and then things go wrong, but how we're born innocent. And of course, inevitably, in that 400-year span, a great deal is left out. But you can't crush every single aspect of what happened, particularly the history of colonialism and so on, which those things are alluded to in the same tone, that was the intention anyway, that Virginia Woolf alluded to these things lightly. So a light touch through a kind of a fictional history, not pretending to be an actual history. But so she was dealing with so many different subjects, really.
I think really that's what the work was for all those years that I was, you were already, formulating a plan before you approached me to be involved. But I was then around for 5 years while you found a way to put things down on paper. And it was mainly about finding a tone. It was more about finding a tone than actual meat and potatoes, nuts and bolts lines, or even direction. It was actually about finding a tone, I think. And as you said,
tone certainly, but also structure. I mean, and some of the structure was discovered in the cutting room. I mean, the big words and things, that was a solution I found in the cutting room when I realized one needed to put forward some very simple bits of information at various moments, just dispatch with them with some wit, if possible.
But they also were all, they were derived from tone. I mean, that yes, it's wit, but it's also that lightness that you describe that's in Virginia Woolf, that I think was really an incredibly just accurate thing that you did, to be so attendant. On the one hand, as everybody knows, adapting particularly a very loved and an extraordinary book into one of those films that people said should never be made because the book was too good, one of those. But that to go straight for the spirit and straight for that tone that she has, that absolute acknowledgement that it's all impossible, but we're going to try anyway. That feeling that it feels like she had. I think it was really extraordinary what you did, Sally Potter, by just downloading that tone. That's all.
The tone, but also being prepared to be, how can I put it, tenderly ruthless with the book. There's a great deal that's left out in order to stay true to the core. And what was interesting reading up how Virginia Woolf herself was spoken about and written about with the book, it was always often trivialized. It was often, it's the light thing, it's not really the work of a serious writer, and so on. And I think that was, again, because of her light touch and her unwillingness to explain or to, one would call it now, virtue signal. I mean, the things were just put there. But there's a great, as well as lightness, wit sometimes, there's also tremendous tenderness about the melancholy of the mutability of all things. So I found, certainly with my memory of the book and my feeling about the film too, is that there's there's melancholy in the meditation of the passing of time, but it's a kind of sweet melancholy. I mean, it's what I feel now looking at you, Tilda. I feel it's a sweet melancholy about the fact that it's 30 years since we worked together in such an incredibly profound and intense way. And I think all the journeys we took, fundraising journeys that didn't go anywhere, and so on, hilarious things, amazing things. The struggle to make something, to share that struggle is a wondrous thing. So, and at the same time, I look at you and I think, oh, time has passed. Time has passed. I mean, you look the same, of course. You know, you don't
actually. It's past. Yeah. And I mean, it was, and this is another thing that might be interesting for a current audience to know. This was a film that people said was impossible, not only because it was, you know, to render into cinema a greatly loved classic book, but also, Sally Potter, you and I, we didn't have anything to rub together. We had no profile as filmmakers. We had no way of knowing how to raise the kind of money that we always wanted to make it, of course, as cheaply as we possibly could. But this was not going to be, you know, in a back room. This was going to be something that was going to need some money. And we went out with the great Christopher Shepherd, who became our producer, being a great documentary filmmaker, made himself a great producer, it basically out of love for you and the film. And out we went with a purely beginner's mind around the world, literally trying to shake people down and failing for most of the time.
I'm remembering something. I'm remembering on a boat, a yacht in Cannes, on one of the ill-fated visits to Cannes. You at that point had very long hair, and somebody, a producer, a financier, let's say, complimented you on your hair without missing a beat. You said, "Yours for 3 million." But which is what we made it for, by the way. And it had been budgeted at 30 million. We made it for 3, but that was due to producerial genius and deals with the Russian studio and timing. You know, it was just coming out of perestroika and so on. So it was in the Soviet Union. We were able to work with the then aging technicians, for example, at Lenfil. So it was a conjunction of historical moment, but also kind of producerial bravado and stamina. You know, we kept at it.
We kept at it, and we're still at it.
And we're still at it.
But I think that, you know, I am a great believer, as I know you are, that, you know, filmmaking does not have to be as painful as it sometimes is. Certainly the raising of finance doesn't have to be the agony that it very often is. It would be very nice if it was easier, always. But I think that it did feed us. I think it defined our journey, and we were not put off, and it did sort of sharpen our wits and our mettle. And the film, you talk about the melancholy in the film, it's also, by the way, not only a film but also based on a book about loneliness, and that in itself kept us going, because we were such a band of fellows, and yet we wanted to make something meaningful about loneliness and about someone looking for fellowship. And of course, that also gave rise to our development, I would say, of this contact with the audience through the lens of the camera.
Which was a direct transposition of what Virginia Woolf continuously says, and dear reader, you know, so she's reaching out across the page. So it was directly that, but of course, initially that was like, I wrote long monologues to camera, which kind of got smaller and smaller, smaller and smaller and smaller, until it was a look. And I remember very, very clearly working on those looks with you, and basically me feeling, either saying or feeling, I am a camera, and you looking at me, and I knew if I laughed or kind of responded to the way that you looked, that was it. That was the thread. And I very quickly became, actually, as I often do when I'm making a film, I don't really feel I'm there. I'm kind of invisible. I am this sort of lens, this sort of look. I am this process of looking. And so, yeah. What can I say except, yeah.
It also came out, I realized, of we met when you first invited me to tea, and put this book down on the table between us, which I remember you asking me quite a long time afterwards if I'd read it, which I found so amazing, because I was clearly so dumbstruck by the fact that you had put down on the table my favorite book when I was at school that I used to literally sleep under my pillow. But the thing as far as I remember, that had prompted you to invite me to tea was that I had been in a one-woman play at the Royal Court, Man to Man by Manfred Karger, in which I spoke. It was like a stand-up show, and I spoke to the audience. And I was clear at that point that I was no longer interested in any theatre, which meant that I was going to have to respect a fourth wall, because I was so interested in talking to the audience. And this also fed into this development of direct contact with the camera, with the audience.
Yeah, well, it was certainly something I came to see you, but let me tell you, it wasn't the play. It was at the very end of the play when you took your bow. And you took off your wig and looked at the audience, and then I went, aha. It was that, not the play. It was that very last moment of actual connection. And it was also the film by Peter Ball and Friendship's Death, which I had seen. And it was also being on marches with you and seeing a sensibility, you know, I remember hanging out in Hyde Park talking about gay rights, I guess it was. We were probably on a section, whatever it was called, 28th March. Yeah. So it was a kind of combination of all those factors, but I will say it again, I've said it many times, I will say it again. There was never anyone else in my mind to embody Orlando other than you. That is a simple fact.
Well, we did it.
We did.
We actually did it. And seemingly we're still doing it. I'm so happy. I mean, I remember, can you imagine 30 years ago, the idea of a you know, gender-free bathroom? You know, it was a distant dream.
Well, I had never perceived bathrooms as having a gender, actually.
Well, by the way, that's the thing.
They didn't have genders in my house anyway.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
But, you know, the idea that 30 years later, and I do hope that when people see this film, they will enjoy that gender freeness, that landscape of boundarylessness, boundarylessness across nationhood, across class, across history, by the way, immortality.
Yeah, immortality itself. Yes, indeed, yeah.